Hey guys, Tom Cecilia Jr. here, aka Mustache Tom, here to do a final review for Resident Evil 3 Remake. I'll be going over the story and gameplay separately, as I normally do, and scoring each individually from each other, as they're the two aspects that I find the strongest in most video games, unless one of them doesn't have a story, but that hasn't happened yet, so here we go. Now, it should be made pretty clear, and I've made this clear in the game when I was playing it, that I did not play the original Resident Evil 3. I watched my brother play it. So I went in, going in, not really having an understanding of what made Resident Evil 3 so successful, the original version anyway. uh, Again, not having a full understanding, but having a slight understanding. And it had been plenty of years, so I'd kind of had forgotten a lot of what happened. So after completing the game, I had a talk. And after having that talk, I believe I'm able to adequately put everything I feel about this game in terms of both story and gameplay. So let's start with the story. Now, it came to my attention that there was quite a bit cut from the Resident Evil 3 remake. Now, initially, I was a little bit perplexed. I was like, that's interesting, but let's just see what happens. So I went through the story, and at first I thought, okay, this seems to be going pretty well so far. Jill wakes up in her home, immediately gets attacked by Nemesis. Okay, that's a quick setup, fine. And it's her job to escape Raccoon City, and she eventually bumps into Carlos. From there, the two kind of work together very briefly and then separate, and then you control Jill, who is trying to work through various parts of the town, which I'll get to later in the gameplay and even in the story. Uh, and from there, she's able to compile what she needs to proceed back to the subway where Carlos was, uh, regroup after encountering the Nemesis once more, and then make her way to the next area. Now, one thing that will be made pretty abundantly clear is that we don't really see Nemesis until a little bit later on, while in the original Resident Evil 3, it would appear that Nemesis consistently chases you throughout Raccoon City, and based on level design, which I'll get to a little bit later in the gameplay, seems to have a little bit less to do here, and his boss encounters really don't help all that much as they're pretty repetitive, the next two anyway. Um, as you encounter him once more in a different area. And the chase continues as Jill eventually gets, at some point when she ends up in the hospital section, she ends up getting infected beforehand and being brought to the hospital, and thus you can take control of Carlos, which is an added part to this game, which I find odd that they would add certain elements and then remove others, but we'll get to that soon enough. Uh, take control of Carlos, uh, make your way through the hospital to make a vaccine for Jill. It turns out they give a little bit back of a backstory saying that Jill had like a closer to something of an immunity, but not quite, something that makes her more resistant, uh, to use the correct terminology there. Uh, so that gives Carlos the amount of time he needs to find the vaccine, get back, give it to her, have a certain amount of time pass, uh, that time which allows for the ticking clock to begin. The ticking clock of the government getting ready to nuke Raccoon City once and for all, unless Jill can get that cure. Uh, which is something that one of the other mercenaries, I already forget his name if I'm being completely honest, and I'm not going to be bothered to look it up. But nonetheless, he tells you that there's a vaccine and that the government will apparently not attack if you can give it to them. So Jill goes with this plan. Nonetheless, you end up in an underground facility, which is vintage Resident Evil. You work your way through the Umbrella facility. You have one Nikolai that is a character you see earlier on, and you really don't see for quite a while, and then he completely goes 100% villain on you from being at least a little bit interesting, to be honest. He kind of just becomes a very generic villain when you see him again, which I'm like, ugh, come on. Anyway, he kind of does his generic villain thing and runs off, uh, and then later on breaks the cure. This leaves Jill and Carlos with nothing left to do but escape the city via helicopter, and that's it. That's the story. It's relatively simple and really, really short. I was actually shocked how quick I was able to get through this game in comparison to Remake Part 2. And again, this comes from a lot of the uh, Part 3 original being cut. There's an entire section or sections apparently that were cut, including one clock tower, that being probably one of the more notable ones that I can remember seeing my brother play. Pretty sure there might have been a few others, but they're not coming to mind, at least right now for me. At any rate, it appears that they also removed the point of choice. This is something the original game had. Resident Evil 3 Classic had these little choices that could vary the story in different ways, or at least more so probably the gameplay in what you're actually doing in the game, causing for more replayability. I don't know how much that affects the story per se, except that you kind of end up in different areas, but I don't know how much that affects the story. Now, here's the thing about choice. And I said this, and it might have sounded really bizarre coming from me, considering I was like, I didn't mind there being removed choice. I'd said this near the end, and what I meant by that, and let me explain why I said that, because it might sound inconsistent to what something I said in another review, but hear me out. There are games that I have played recently that don't have choice, such as God of War and Marvel Spider-Man. These are two games that immediately come to mind that are story-driven games that have, you know, they don't have choice, but they're really, really good. And I thought that's what the case for Resident Evil 3 was going to be. I thought originally that the choice was going to be removed, but the story overall was going to be improved. I was quickly proven to be wrong, as the story is so simplistically simple and short and overall bad. And that kind of shocked me that that actually happened. So they had two options, at least in my mind: make the story significantly longer, or retain the choice. One of these two things could have been the case, and I would have been fine with either of them, honestly, but they chose the worst of both choices. They made the game shorter and they removed the choice. None of these options make any sense. And what could have fixed this in terms of story is adding a separate campaign for Carlos. That would have probably fixed a lot of the issues that I have with this game in terms of story. If you're going to remove choice, then add elements to elevate everything else. Give Jill more development. Give Carlos more to do that makes his appearances make more logical sense. He literally just appears out of nowhere at the end in the umbrella scenario, and he literally just kind of comes out of nowhere. It doesn't make any sense. If we were playing as Carlos in his separate campaign, that would have added to a second gameplay loop, and then we could figure out all these different things about Carlos. How did he get here? What's his deal, more or less? How did he get to the hospital? How did he get from the hospital to the location he ends up in the Umbrella environment? This is a completely different gameplay story, and it adds to the overall story, and it also adds to the gameplay. This could have been an element that they had because it's present in part two. You have the Leon story, and you have, uh, oh geez, I'm gonna probably forget. I think it was Claire, or yeah, I think it's Claire. Oh my god, I almost said Rebecca. Jesus Christ. Anyway, uh, anyways, they had two separate campaigns causing for replayability, and it lengthened the game overall. Again, the game doesn't have either of these things, so it ends up being, again, the worst of both scenarios. It's shorter and it doesn't have choice, so it ends up being really, really bad and really, really short, which is so inconvenient because I feel like that from what we do have, Jill and Carlos kind of suffer because of this. I guess their character is fine, but it's so short-lived is that we don't get to really see enough to have that much of an impact when compared to other games that have much better story and much better character development through them. This is something that's ever present. And here's the thing is that I'm able to overlook some of the goofier elements of Resident Evil because that is a hallmark of Resident Evil. So Jill being able to survive a nuke explosion, I'm able to go, it's not the crazy. I mean, it's definitely not the craziest thing I've seen in Resident Evil, that's for sure. Um, there are definitely other crazy elements I've seen from Resident Evil, from people being able to punch huge boulders, that being Chris, to Leon and uh, I think he used teams with Chris again in the animated movie, able to like super fight their way through a horde, which is one of the craziest things I've ever seen in terms of like both animation and just like overall badassery, but that's besides the point. Uh, from the wild nature that is Wesker and his supernatural abilities, there are elements in the Resident Evil story that are a bit beyond human evolution, or elevation, I should say. So, again, those things don't necessarily distract me as much as the story was obviously cut and the choice was obviously removed. So that removes so much potential for what could have been a much better story and for much more gameplay. So both of them suffer from the same thing. And I'm sad to report that I'm going to give the story of Resident Evil 3 a 4 out of 10. This is below average for storytelling. It completely cuts so much content, and and if they were to add anything, it's clearly a Carlos campaign, which they didn't bother to do. So it fails on a lot of different levels here. It's too short, and it's way, way, way cut from anything that I can see as acceptable. So again, that's a 4 out of 10. Very disappointing in terms of story. In terms of gameplay, uh, the shooting is consistently as strong as it was from part 2. I don't find any issue with that whatsoever. In terms of Nemesis, is where every issue comes in. Again, to make the comparison to Original 3, his movement and overall, you know, placement in the game is bad. Uh, in comparison to Mr. X, uh, while he chased you in a much smaller environment, technically speaking, he at least consistently followed you even in the save point area. So Mr. X felt naturally more threatening in a smaller space. So how is it that Nemesis had a slightly bigger space, yet he seems to follow you for a lot less of the time. And then a lot of that is scripted within the cutscenes too, by the way. And I think the problem is Raccoon City, in terms of its uh, structure in this game, is actually surprisingly still too small. Uh, I found myself going through Raccoon City, even not experience it for the first time, or going through it for the first time, relatively quickly. I found myself just kind of breezing through, with slightly struggling to figure out some of the going back and forth parts. But if you were to cut the back and going back and forth parts and just look at the entire city as an entire landscape, it's actually relatively small if you really think about it. And that's kind of embarrassing. I thought Raccoon City would be much larger. It's called Raccoon City. You have an entire city to explore, and you're kind of in and out of it in quite again, a really short amount of time. It's actually really poor level design. I thought we were going to be going through the entire city of Raccoon City. I thought we were going to be there for a much longer time. I thought that Nemesis was going to be chasing us all throughout said city, and none of these elements are present in the remake. And it just comes off as kind of embarrassing that you had all this time, or I should say lack thereof, because this was, let's be fair, being developed pretty close to part 2, so I still don't see that as an excuse, though, for the lack of level design in part 3. Clearly, they did not do enough work to expand upon the city. Clearly, they cut content. Clearly, they made Nemesis a joke of a boss to fight, where he just circles around and sort of just lands in certain areas, and you can exploit him relatively easily by throwing one grenade at him and he's down. It's so embarrassing. It just drags down the gameplay at every boss encounter. Even the last one has the obvious weak points, which is more so vintage Resident Evil, but still, even with that, it just feels so bland and boring. So with that, I'm gonna give the gameplay, uh, I don't know, because the zombie part is fine, and I didn't have any problems with the camera, which I heard other people complain about. So I don't know if that was based off of the environment. It could very well be. I think I would go between a 4 or a 5 out of 10. I feel like there's half of the gameplay is solid and half of the gameplay when it comes to Nemesis and the environments are severely lacking. And all of that needed to be overhauled and really re-looked upon to give a full gameplay experience. So, when it comes to overall score, again, story is a 4, gameplay is a 5, if I'm being generous. So this ended up being closer to more of one of my rants than an actual review, which I'm actually kind of shocked by again. I thought that there was going to be a lot more. This ended up disappointing me at the end of the day. Their campaign, or I should say Jill's one campaign, was way too short and didn't feel compelling enough to argue the removal of choice. In terms of Carlos, he appears out of nowhere, and so on and so forth, as I mentioned, just to reiterate once more. So, in terms of game, if I were to say jump into Resident Evil, I would say stick to Resident Evil 2. It's much more solid in terms of both gameplay and story. And there was the online game, Resident Evil uh, Resilience, I think it was called. I didn't get a chance to personally play it, so I can't comment on how bad it was, except that I can tell you that other people said that it was bad too. So that doesn't do the game any favors, even if it did come for free, whatever, that doesn't matter. If people are saying it's bad and it looks bad, then it's bad. I really can't add anything other than to say what I think other people have said in that regard. Uh, Outside of that, that's pretty much it for Resident Evil 3 and all of its additional little side content. I should also add that they removed, in the process of doing this as well, the mercenary mode, which was apparent in the original Resident Evil 3, which is another question mark when it comes to overall gameplay. You would think that they would keep this to keep players engaged, but no, they seem to opt in for this more poorly designed online co op mode that seems to be, from what I could see, breaking at the seams. So, bad. Very bad. I don't know why they did that. It seems like very poor choicing in all of its decision making. Hopefully, there can be hope for Resident Evil 8. I know that's like some odd numbers removed from 3, but it's also called Resident Evil Village, I guess. Um, but we shall see. In terms of what I saw from the trailer, it looks a bit odd, considering. Um, I don't know how biohazard, translates to werewolves yet, but I'm willing to look into it, I guess? I don't know. The last Resident Evil from that one was one that I did not play, so I can't comment on it. The last one I played was 6, and that one was really, really bad, so I don't know how confident I am in 8. I can't remark on 7, so I don't know again how confident I feel in Resident Evil 8. Anyway, that's for another time. Uh, at any rate, overall, actually pretty disappointing remake, and that's kind of bad. If only they separated it a bit more from 2. I feel like if they left themselves some leeway instead of rushing the game, which I'm gonna assume is the case based off of the timing from 2 to 3, I think this game could have been really solid. Could have remained with the choice, or remained being one story, but just told a lot better. As is, it's a bad remake. And that's what I have to say on the matter. Anyways, if you ended up enjoying the review, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, make sure to check out those links in the description. One will head over to my Discord server, the other to my Patreon page. Any donations are greatly appreciated. Until next time, everyone. Bye bye.